Hello and welcome to a deck profile for the premium format. Today we're talking about Granblue, one of the most important decks to know if you want to be a contender in this format. Granblue has been a top tier for a long time and likely will be a top tier for the foreseeable future unless it gets hit by multiple bannings, because there's not really one card in particular you could take out and keep this deck from being a top tier threat. Granblue has a lot of strengths. It has graveyard manipulation, it has hard search effects, it has multi-attack, it has defensive effect for playing a controlling game plan, it has a late game scaling and inevitability. Really, the only weakness of Granblue is that it's a very difficult deck to pilot, but if you are the better player, you should win against almost any deck. I can't really think of a deck that's like an auto-loss matchup for Granblue. It has a very good matchup spread, but it's not heavily favored in any of its matchups. It's slightly favored in all of its favorable matchups, in my opinion. So you need to be the better pilot, and then those matchups become heavily favored. But there's nothing really that you're a dog against, and you can also tune this deck incredibly well. Because it's playing a lot of one-ofs, there's a lot of room to swap out tech slots. And that means you can build this deck to beat, hypothetically, any metagame. As long as you're prepared, as long as you know how to play this deck well, and as long as you don't get trigger stacked, which is, of course, a problem that every deck faces, you can theoretically do well in any format. And this has historically always been one of the most topping decks in Premium. Without any further ado, let's get into the list. Starting with Peter the Ghosty, our starter. There is some synergy with Ghosty cards, so there is a reason to play this over other starters, but it doesn't matter that much. Next up, we have our primary ride target. 3 copies of Vampire Princess of Nightfog Nightrose, the G version. This lets us go into our History Collection stride, Bandit Rum, which will generate 2 protect markers and call a card from drop on hit, which will always activate. This card isn't really that good aside from that, but it does have some useful effects. When you stride over it, you can counterblast a call card from drop, which is pretty good. It's good value, and we have some very devastating cards to call from drop. And when your rear guard's retired, you can mill 3 to call the retired card back, which is an effect that you have to be extremely careful if you ever want to use it, because deck out is a problem with Granblue, but only if you're not careful. A skilled Granblue pilot shouldn't lose very many, if any, games to deck out. The cat's poking at my back. Next up, we have the V version of the same name, Nightrose. The reason we play this is because one of our strides allows us to ride a card from drop, and by putting this into drop ahead of time, we'll be able to ride into this in the middle of the battle phase and get essentially a Vanguard restand, and as well as generate another protect marker, as well as get a Vanguard that has a useful battle phase effect. When this card attacks, you counterblast 1 and you call a column of cards, 2 cards, and then if your opponent's Vanguard's greater or greater, this unit gets 10k. Because we have cards that can call other cards from drop, this essentially is a full board call in the middle of the battle phase. And then when your rear guard attacks or boosts, it gets 5k and then retires itself, which is actually a good thing, because then we can call those cards from drop to reuse the same card multiple times in the same battle phase. This is a really strong card, and riding into this card in battle with one of our strides is our primary win con. Next, we have 2 copies of Ghosty Leader Beatrice. Now, this card serves a different role. It is technically a viable ride target, and you will ride this to get a protect marker in some number of your games, but it does a few other things for us. One, when it's placed, we Soul Blast a card not named, or we Soul Blast 1 and call a card not named Beatrice from drop zone R, which means we can call almost anything in our deck. And then, when your rear guard's retired, you can counterblast 1 and call a Ghosty, with grade less than the grade of the retired card and drops an R, but that's only when it's on Vanguard, and that's only going to happen in a small number of games because we generally want to go on to Nightrose. And then it also gives Ghosties Intercept and 5k Shield and 5k Power, which does matter. If we're riding this card, then on the opponent's turn, all our Ghosties have extra shield value for some survivability. It also matters if you're on this Vanguard and your opponent dominates you with the Goku, and then leaves those units in play. They will gain Intercept and 5k Shield if they made you call a stride with Ghosty in its name. So there's a bunch of minor synergies there. But this card serves 2 primary roles. One, it can call Skull Dragon. And it can call Skull Dragon when called by this, so that we can get, like, when we have effects that say we have to call cards with different names, we can call Beatrice as one of the cards and get a second Skull Dragon, so we can pressure the opponent the hardest with our biggest card. The other advantage of this is that we can call this card with one of our G Guardians, which will then let us call basically anything on our drop. So we can use this to ambush the opponent with effects like Honolly or with Skeleton Cannoneer, and we can retire a unit. So we get Battle Phase Retire, also called a Denial Griffin play by the community, and that is one of the strongest defensive options you can play. Having access to Battle Phase Retire makes or breaks a deck's defense, and so many decks in the meta can't handle Battle Phase Retire, and you just basically skip the opponent's turn if you can pull it off at the right moment. So knowing when to go for it at the right time and knowing which cards to hit is going to be part of playing this deck. This deck has a lot of defensive power, so you're going to need to get really good at defense quickly if you want to master this deck. Next, we have Mighty Rogue Nightstorm. This has the auto ability Hollow. Remember to declare Hollow whenever you place a Hollow unit. Otherwise, if you don't declare it, you will not be able to retire the unit later. But Hollow basically makes a unit die at the end of turn. And it triggers a variety of effects that care about hollowed units. And then this has an auto skill on R, GB1. At the end of the battle, it attacked a Vanguard. You counterblast 1, and if this unit's hollowed, remember, you got to declare that, you may pay the cost. And if you do, you choose a card not named Nightstorm from the drop zone and called R on a circle this unit is not on. This is going to let us call dragons in the middle of battle phase, or we can call Beatrice, which can then call anything we want to give us a larger attack chain, depending on if the opponent's like at 5 and has no defenses or anything. This is basically just going to be a multi-attack enabler, an attack extender. It's pretty good. It has another skill when it's placed on V. You will literally never ride this card. Next, we have one copy of Sea Strike Dragon and Largolf, and there's going to be a lot of one-ups in this deck. This is Stride Fodder, and it draws a card when you pitch it for Stride. Or, when you place it, you can Soul Blast 1 and choose a Grade 2 or greater card with a different card name from this unit from your drop and add it to hand. So this can grab our Grade 3 heals so we get more G-Guardians, or it can grab other important utility pieces. It's worth noting that you need to be on Grade 4 to use this skill, so you can only really use this card after you've used your Stride, and you're on a Grade 4 Vanguard. So don't play this before using your History Collection Stride or anything like that. You need to be on Grade 4 to use these skills. We literally can't use the Guardian skill because we're never on a Grade 4 on the opponent's turn. Next, we have 2 copies of Dragon Undead Skull Dragon. This is the best attacker in the deck. It has a skill in hand that it cannot be normal called. So that means we have to superior call this card somehow, usually with Beatrice or with Nightstorm from the drop. Then it has continuous on V or R. It gets 2k for every card in your drop zone. And Granblue is a clan based around self-mill, so this card will get huge fast. It regularly hits in the 70 to 80 range. And then at the end of the battle it attacked, it retires itself, which sounds like a downside, but again, it really isn't because so many of our effects call from drop that this retiring itself essentially lets us reuse it multiple times in the same turn. Next up is our Grade 2s, and we have 4 copies of Pirate Swordsman Columbard. This is our best ride target. It's usually what you're going to want to try to ride on every turn 2. When this is placed on V or R, you counterblast 1, and you search your deck for up to 1 card and discard it and shuffle the deck, and then you call a card from drop to R. And it has a hard once per turn clause, no using multiple Columbards. This is primarily going to find setup cards for later. Usually it's going to find this Ghost Ship, which I'll get to in a second. And that's going to give you your highest pressure turn 2, as well as plus you a bunch of cards. In the late game, you're generally going to be looking for things like Skull Dragon or V Nightrose or other cards to make sure that you can set up for your kill turn, or you're going to try to find defensive pieces that you can then put in hand with your recursion effects. Basically, the problem with trying to explain the function of cards in Granblue is that a lot of cards in this deck are multifunctional and are going to depend heavily on the context of the game you're playing and what's in your damage zone and whether you were able to go into Obadiah that turn. So I can tell you Columbard's used for one thing, but if you're careful and you pay attention, you'll find other uses for it. And I'm sure there's Granblue Masters that say, actually, you only use it for this and stuff like that. This deck is really hard to play. Next, we have Stormride Ghost Ship. This is usually what you're going to find on turn 2 with Columbard. This has a skill like the dragon that it cannot be normal called. And then when it attacks, it gets plus 15k until end of the battle, and at the end of the battle, it draws a card and retires itself. So this gives you both a huge attacker on turn 2 and also card draw. And again, this isn't a downside because if you have ways to superior call this card in the battle phase, you can use it again. Next, we have 1 copy of Skeleton Cannoneer. This has the hollow effect, and then on GB1, Counterblast 1, when it's placed on R from your drop, you may pay the cost, and if you do, you retire an opponent's rear guard, and then if it's hollowed, you can draw a card. So when you're using this defensively, it will essentially replace the cost of calling it, because you had to pitch a heal trigger to G Guardian, but then you're going to draw cards. You've stayed at basically 0 cards changed, and then if you're low on cards in deck, you can just choose not to hollow this, and you won't draw a card from this effect, and then you can avoid decking yourself. So you got that going for you. But generally, the play is you play a G Guardian that calls Beatrice. Beatrice calls this card retires something, and it's a play that overall will cost 2 Counterblast. So anytime a Granblue player is 2 Counterblast, you have to be wary of this card. And that means that your opponents are going to be asking you whether this is in your drop and whether Beatrice is in your drop and stuff like that. And if you're playing against Granblue, you should be asking those questions whenever you're going into battle. For you, this is a high priority card to put into the drop zone so that you can set up that defensive play to scare the opponent. Next, we have 1 copy of Greed Shade. This card has continuous on V or R during your turn. If your drop zone is 10 number cards, it gets plus 5k. And then auto on R, when placed, discard a card from hand, put 2 cards on the top of the deck into drop, and return a card not named Greed Shade from drop to hand. So this can get back anything you need, really, except itself, but you only play 1 copy, so that's fine, which can greatly improve your defensive power and also improve your combo potential by helping you get back pieces that you need. However, because it does mill 2 to use that effect, it does increase your chance of deck out if you use Greed Shade multiple times in a game, so be careful. Next, we have 1 copy of Jesse the Ghosty. This has a skill from drop zone. You can retire 2 rearguards not named Jesse the Ghosty and call itself to R from drop, and that has a hard once per turn clause. They were really scared of this effect being broken somehow. And then has auto skill on R. When it attacks, this unit gets 5k. And then at the end of the battle, it retires itself. And if you did not countercharge from a Jesse the Ghosty ability this turn, you countercharge 1. So just more countercharge. This deck has a lot of resource spending effects, but it also has a lot of resource generation. Then we have 1 copy of Sylvan Hornbeast Npix. This is a card from Standard. It has back row. This unit gets plus 10k. And if you have 3 or less rear guards, all of your rear guards in the same column as this unit cannot be chosen by your opponent's card effects. So this is going to be a way to set up an untargetable column, which is really important in the Shiranui and in the Link Joker matchups. Link Joker will force you to call cards locked, but as long as you have an Npix and a unit in front of it, you'll at least have 1 column preserved at all times. Against Shiranui, having just Npix in play will make it so that they can't dominate anything. They won't be able to choose the Npix itself, and if they force you to call any units, you call them to the same column as Npix, and then those units will be protected from the effect. And because we're a protect clan that gets protect markers, if they try to use Rene to force us to call from hand, we can just call our protect markers, and Shiranui will get no dominates out of us. This is really important because Shiranui needs a dominate attack to go off in order to use its restanders, except for Virina. This means that by strategically leaving just Npix in play every turn, which we can do because a lot of our units have hollow or otherwise retire themselves on attack, we can deny them half their game plan. And this makes Shiranui matchup for Granblue really strong. This also lets us basically beat any deck that's focused around killing units to get some kind of benefit. As long as we just leave Npix, they can't kill anything. But we'll still have a unit in play, so if they have effects that care about us having no units, that also doesn't work. Next up is our grade 1s, and we're starting with 4 copies of Tommy the Ghosty Brothers. This is the top 5 checker for grade 3 that every clan has, and it gets 5k if our drop is 5 or more cards. It'll add a grade 3 and we'll discard a card if we reveal a grade 3. Basically just there to make sure we hit Nightrose on turn 3. It's also our best ride target technically because it's the only grade 1 that isn't some kind of utility card. Next, we have 2 copies of Hanli. You can play, the second Hanli can be basically any grade 1 tech card, but I think with the Harry deck surging in popularity, possibly, as we enter the end of the BCS season for 2025, it's a good chance you're going to need Hanli more than any other tech card right now. So I would recommend playing 2 Hanli, but if you feel really confident in your ability to beat Harry, maybe you play only 1 Hanli. But for now, I'm playing 2, and I think that's pretty good. Next, we have 2 copies of Witch Doctor of Powdered Bone, Negro Bone. This has a skill in the drop zone that you discard a card from hand and put this card on the bottom of the deck, and you call a grade 1 from drop to R, but if your drop is 10 or more cards, you can call anything instead. So this is a way to call the dragon from drop without having to spend any other effects, which is really nice. This also puts itself to the bottom of the deck, so it's a way to fill your deck up to make sure you don't deck out on the final turn of the game. If you have exactly 3 cards in deck, you can use one of these to go up to 4 cards in deck, and then now you won't deck out. This is a pretty good card, and a lot of our stuff will let you like chain calls. Like if you use this to call Beatrice, and the Beatrice can call something else, you can end up with a full board off of 1 card. So this is a low priority card to put in the drop. It's good to have, but you don't really need it until the end game scenarios. So it's not super essential to set up right away, but it's nice to have in the drop. And if you've already got other important cards in your drop zone, you can then search for this card. Next, we have our perfect guards, 3 copies of Water Spout to Djinn, which is just an ordinary perfect guard, and if you have additional copies of Djinn in the drop zone when you play this, you get to countercharge 1. So this is really good because, again, we can pick up perfect guards from the drop zone, and countercharge is a really important resource generation effect for us to have access to because so much of our stuff costs counterblast. This will also let us play more crits because we are not spending that slot on draw trigger PGs. And then we have 1 copy of Undying Departed Grenache. This is another starter, but we're not going to play it as a starter. What it does is when it's put into the drop zone from R due to the effect of the Hollow ability, and it has Hollow, you can countercharge 2. So this is a really aggressive countercharger. And that's what it's here for. We're going to search for this on a turn that we plan to spend a lot of counterblast, and we're going to call it to set up for additional countercharge shenanigans. Next up, we have our triggers, and we have 4 grade 3 heals. You can play one of the countercharge heal if you really want, but I think 4 grade 3 heals is better. This has an anti-aggro effect. You can give your Vanguard 10k or -2 crit if you're not on grade 3 yet. And then they pitch for stride. And importantly, because they're grade 3, we can pick them up with Enlargulv. So Enlargulv can guarantee G Guardians for the next turn, and we don't need to find additional heals. As long as we've seen 1 heal, we can get at least 1 G Guardian every turn. Then we have our crits. 4 copies of Rampage Shade. This is the History Collection draw crit. They draw a card when you hit them as a defensive. And if you swing and you have a Nightrose Vanguard, you can put them into your soul and draw a card and give your Vanguard 5k, which is an effect we will use some number of games just to generate soul. Then we have 4 copies of our Stride crit, Chad the Ghosty. And then we have 3 copies of Wild Seas Banshee. This is a GB1 soul crit. When your Vanguard attacks, you put this into soul, you draw a card, and your Vanguard gets 10k. This is just for the soul generation and the card draw. It's a really nice effect to have access to, and we want as many crits as possible to make our Skull Dragons extra threatening. And then we have 1 Stoicheia Overtrigger, Bless Favor. This gives you 1 of every trigger effect, which is really strong. And then we have our orders. We have 1 Elementaria Sanctitude and 1 Forvidal Surrogate, this is a really important card for the deck. It's going to let you call dragons. It's going to let you search for dragons. It's going to enable lots of shenanigans if you call Beatrice with this. It's a pretty solid card overall. Does a lot of work for us. And we can get it with Enlargulv if it ends up in the drop zone. But remember, you can only play 1 Regardless piece per game. Next up is our G-Zone. Starting with 2 copies of Bandit Rum. This is what we go into on turn 3 going first. It generates 2 protects, lets us call something from drop on hit. So we can use this to reuse the ship and get 2 activations of the ship in 1 turn. And then we have Ghosty Great Emperor Big Obadiah. This is our setup stride. It has an act skill, counterblast 1, flip a card in the G zone, and you search your deck for 5 cards and put them in the drop. Shuffle the deck and call 2 cards from the drop to R for each face-up card in your G zone. Which means that if we go into this as our first stride, we're only going to get to call 2 things. But if we go into it on turn 4 after History Collection, we get to call 6 things, which is more than the circles we have. So you just basically get to call a full board. And then they each get 5k until end of turn, so that'll give you some nice pressure. You go into this stride to set up your drop zone for later. You can use this to find all the pieces of the defensive play of the Skeleton Cannoneer and the Beatrice to set that up. You can use this to find the V Nightrose to rewrite into with our next stride, Bad Bounty. You can find the dragons if you need to, so that you have something to Superior Call and get big attacks with. You can find the Night Storm to set up multi-attack. You can find the Negro Lilies in order to get call from drop effects from the drop, as well as a way to put cards back in the deck. You can get anything you need, and this card is part of why Granblue is so strong, is that it can always get the perfect setup of the toolbox that it needs every game with this stride. Ideally, you'll only have to activate one Obadiah, but some games you'll have to activate it twice in order to get everything you need. So we play 2 copies. Next, we have our primary win con. This is 3 copies of Bad Bounty. We play 3 copies of this because it's also our only game plan against Gridora. What Bad Bounty does is at the end of the battle it attacked, you counterblast 1 and discard 3 cards, and you put this into the G zone face up and ride a grade 3 from drop as standing, preferably the V Nightrose, so that we get more multi-attack and a protect marker. This is a really powerful stride. It doesn't plus us that many cards though. We're essentially losing all 3 cards from the triple drive and only getting the twin drive for that turn. But that's still pretty good. On top of that, getting to rewrite a Vanguard, it means that we can potentially generate 2 protect markers every turn by riding something that generates a protect and then riding a protect generating card from drop. So this combined with the fact that Beatrice Soul Blast 1 and thus can Soul Blast out the card that we had as our grade 3 originally, we can basically keep looping that setup, and that's how we beat Gridora. We stall the game out, we farm protect markers every single turn, 2 of them to be precise, and then we just drag the game out until they're out of Gridoras, and then eventually we go into one of our other late game strides and we can kill them. Against most decks, the play is going to Bad Bounty, attack with dragons, attack with this, attack with dragons, swing with Nightrose, call another board full of dragons, swing with the dragons again, and that lets us get a lot of uses of Skull Dragon, and that's a lot of power, and we've potentially put crits on those dragons, and thus the opponent is very likely dead, because the Skull Dragon is so big that it essentially demands a perfect guard every time. So this is our main win con. We need to have a pretty good setup drop zone for it. We want to have a lot of cards in drops so that the dragons are huge. We need specific pieces in drops that we can ride into them with Bad Bounty and Superior Call them to get the Superior Call multi-attack shenanigans. So you can't go into it until after 1 Obadiah at least, usually. Next we have our other win con, Pirate King of Everlasting Darkness Bartholomew. This has the effect that when it attacks, you counterblast 1 and choose 3 cards with different names from the drop and call them to R, and those called units get plus 5k until end of turn. Now, where this comes into the late game is that its other effect is that if your drop has 30 or more cards, when your opponent would call cards from hand to G, they must call 3 or more at the same time. This is a very potent guard restrict, and remember that the best way to deal with Skull Dragon is to perfect guard it because it hits for such big numbers. If we have 30 cards in drop, Skull Dragon is getting plus 60,000, which makes it a 72k attacker minimum. 72,000 is basically unguardable for most decks. So that means they're going to have to perfect guard it, and this is going to demand 3-card guard, so the perfect guard will discard a card, and then they'll have to call 2 more cards with the Guardian to fulfill the 3-card guard restriction. This basically means that they're eating 4 cards out of hand every time Skull Dragon attacks, unless they want to die. So it's best to go into this when they're at 5 and they can't afford to hit defensives. And that basically is going to drain their entire hand. Especially if we go into this after a Bad Bounty turn, then we got a lot of cards out of their hand already with forcing them to guard Skull Dragons on the previous turn. Going into this, the turn after that, will slam the door shut and end the game. The only problem is that any scenario where we have 30 cards in drop, we are very close to deck out. And we likely are at the end of our rope in terms of resources and cards in hand, so it sometimes can be difficult to get the perfect setup with this card. But just as long as you play carefully, it should be doable. There's very few decks in the format that can survive this. The primary way they can survive this is by just being at really low damage and no guarding stuff, or by somehow saving all of their G Guardians for this card. Next up, we have our GB8, Unfading Ship Immortal Galleon. On place on V, we choose 5 cards on the drop and call them to R, and they get 10k until end of turn, and at the end of that turn, we retire the units called to this effect. So this is just going to set up a really weak turn, but all the units will at least be boosted by 10k, which will include the back row units, so you'll have plus 10k boosters. So the numbers will actually be decent, but we're not really getting as many multi-attacks as we could. Basically, the Night Storm will give us 1 additional attack, and this will be like a 4-attack turn. But the main advantage of this is that this stride costs no resources. It doesn't cost soul or counterblast. So we can go into this when we don't have any CB, which is nice. And we can call 2 dragons and swing with this, and perhaps they're dead. But it's GB8, so it's a late game option only. So just keep that in mind. It's usually not going to be our game plan, but it's nice to have the option. And then next up is our G Guardians, which I'll lay out together because G Guardians are a package. and must be considered as one. We have these three, these two, and this one. Let's start with the most important one. This is Great Witch Doctor of Banquets, Negro Lily. I think I called the other grade one Negro Lily by accident. This is Negro Bone. Negro Lily has the effect that lets us set up our defensive play. You counterblast one and you choose a rear guard and retire it. So remember, you need to keep a rear guard in play for that combo. And when this unit's placed on G, you may pay the cost. If you do, you choose a normal unit with ghosting in its name from your drop, call it to an open R, and this unit gets 10k shield. This will call Beatrice. Beatrice will Soul Blast one and call the Cannoneer. The Cannoneer will retire a unit. And because this will get plus 10k shield, and because we can intercept with the Cannoneer, we can usually guard one attack with this and kill the other rear guard in the front row and shut down 2 attacks for 1 G Guardian, which is really strong. Plus, we'll draw a card off the Cannoneer. So this is very potent on defense, but it costs a lot of resources. This is our other primary G Guardian. This is Oriana. When this unit's placed on G, you counterblast 1, and the attacking unit gets -1 crit for every 10 cards in your drop. So this only really is active in the mid to late game, but it will shut down any attack, no matter how big it is, just by making the attack do 0 damage. It's not that hard to get 20 cards in drop and give -2 crit to even something with 100 million on it. And then lastly, we have 1 copy of Negro Nora. This has GB1, Soul Blast 1, and flip a G Guardian face up. When the unit's placed on G, pay the cost. If you do, choose 2 cards of different grades from the drop and call them to G. The main use of this is that it's a G Guardian that doesn't cost Counterblast, but we don't like to use it because our G Guardians are so good and we have ways to recycle heals that we usually can get all 4 G Guardians off per game. Remember, you can't G Guardian if you have 4 face up already. So using this means we're essentially getting 1 fewer G Guardian than we should. So it doesn't feel great to use this, but we can use it and preserve our counterblast. And if we call a grade 3 heal and a grade 0 trigger, we can usually guard anything. If the over trigger's in the drop, we can really guard anything with this. And then lastly, we have 1 Harmonics Messiah, but it's proxy because it's in another deck. So this is the G zone in the deck. That is... I'll try to explain what the attack pattern will look like, but keep in mind that I'm not a Granblue expert, and this is a hard deck to play. So we're going to need a big drop zone for this pattern to kill the opponent, so keep that in mind. And we're going to also need a bunch of cards in Soul, as well as a bunch of damage. So we're going to need to be on Bad Bounty, ideally, for this. And then we can do something like use Forbidal or some other effects in order to get dragons into play. Depending on how much CP we have, we could go for a Nightstorm plus a dragon to get 3 attacks, or we could just go for 2 dragons. It's not really going to be super important how we get there, but getting 2 dragons into play is pretty easy. Forbidal can do it by getting a dragon plus a Beatrice, and then you can call the dragon with Beatrice's skill over herself, and that will be that. So we can have a big drop zone, 2 dragons in play, and this. We're going to also need in our drop zone, we're going to need... for sure, Nightstorm and V Nightrose at minimum, but anything else will be nice to have too. And I'm going to assume we have no boosters. So you would swing with the Vanguard first to try to hit crits to make these dragons scarier. You're going to do 3 drive checks. It's not going to matter. Preferably, you'll hit some crits to make these really scary. Then you'll activate this skill, your Counterblast 1. You'll discard 3 cards. You'll ride the V Nightrose from your drop zone, which will give you another protect marker, as well as restand your Vanguard. Now you can swing with these dragons, and they will retire at the end of battle. If we have a big drop zone when we do this, these can easily be swinging for the 60s or 70s. Then we swing with the Nightrose and Counterblast again, and we get to call a column. So you have a few options here. If you just want dragons and you don't want to spend a ton of counterblast, you can call a column like this, use Beatrice's skill to call another dragon, and have basically a full board restand, and get 2 more dragon swings after this. Or you can do something like this and call a Beatrice and a Nightstorm, and the Beatrice can call a dragon. This is also better to do if you only have 1 dragon, like you damaged one, or one's in your bind zone or in the deck still somehow. You swing here, you do 2 drive checks. Hopefully you hit some triggers. You can put the crit on the dragon and the power on Nightstorm. Swing with the dragon, retire it. Swing with the Nightstorm, call a dragon, end a battle. Swing with the dragon, retire it. End a turn, this would retire. Now this was a lot of attacks and a lot of very high quality attacks because Skull Dragon scales 2k for every card on the drop. So these are big numbers. It's easy to set this combo up. 1 Obadiah activation can get you all the necessary pieces you need. And if any of the pieces are already in your hand, you can, and or you milled them from other effects earlier, or you pitched them to stride, then you can easily find this plus other useful things with your Obadiah. The only reason you wouldn't want to go into this right away if you had all the pieces, that your drop zone won't be big enough for the dragon to be threatening. So you need the dragon to really be an inconveniently large number for this combo to be good. But once you have that drop zone built up, you can go into this, and it's pretty hard for the opponent to survive, but it does cost a lot of counterblast. There are variations of it, of course, that can make it cost less counterblast. You can skip the Nightstorm and just get Dragon plus Beatrice plus Dragon. You could go into a Beatrice instead of a V Nightrose. Beatrice will call something not named herself, so you can do something like just call the dragon right away and get one more attack, so on and so forth. There are variations on the pattern. You could, instead of getting 2 dragons early, if you need the counter charge, you could get something like Jesse the Ghosty as one of your attackers, and then you could swing with this to countercharge in the middle of the battle phase and extend the number of attacks, which is pretty good if the opponent has low cards in hand or is at 5 and can't afford to no guard and take defensives. There's a lot of options here, and it's going to come down to what you damaged as well, or if your opponent's playing things that bind your cards from drop, like Narukami. All those can affect what combo routes you take. Granblue is an incredibly complicated deck to play. Because it has so much searching and has so much superior call from drop, really you're limited only by your imagination and by the size of your deck and drop zone. Of course, the more times you use effects like this GB skill, or if you use cards like Greed Shade, the closer you'll get to deck out, and the more you'll checkmate yourself. If your opponent somehow survives your Bartholomew turn, you're probably going to deck out, and they've won the game. But the good news is that because you scale with the number of cards in drop, it's very unlikely that your opponent survives those scenarios. That's all for now. Keep in mind that I've only scratched the surface of explaining how this deck works. I can't really explain to you in great detail how to play every matchup with this or all the different options you have for attack patterns, because we would be here all day. There are so many iterations and opportunities you can make with this deck that I can't even begin to cover them all. And this flexibility is going to reward an experienced pilot, and it's going to punish an inexperienced one. So I recommend, if you like this deck, if you like the pirates, if you like the undead theme, that you get it early, like start building it as soon as you can, and play with it as much as you can against as many different kinds of opponents as you can. You can practice the basic stuff like searching for the straightforward combo route and practicing that alone, and then you need to know how you adapt that for every matchup. Do you focus on defense? Do you focus on damage denying the opponent to stall for the late game? Do you pivot to being a pure aggro deck in some matchups? That's all up to you to figure out. But in any case, that's all I've got for now. As always, good luck card fighting.